Imagine a summer afternoon, August 29th, 1944. The air near Châlons-Champagne, northeastern France, is heavy with the scent of damp earth and distant conflict. Oberst Friedrich Müller, a seasoned German officer, lowers his field glasses, his hands trembling. What he's just witnessed shatters every preconceived notion he holds about warfare, about supply, about what an army can and cannot do. Stretching to the horizon, an endless roaring column of American trucks, each packed with jerry cans of gasoline, flows eastward, a liquid river of power. He turns to his adjutant, Hauptmann Wilhelm Kroer, and speaks words that would echo not just through their command post, but through the entire collapsing German Western Front. Words that would come to define the collision between two eras of warfare. "My God," he says, "no army can stop that. We are not fighting soldiers. We are fighting a machine." This wasn't just a moment of tactical observation. It was a revelation. It was the dawning realization for the German High Command that they weren't just losing battles, they were losing the very idea of war as they knew it. They were battling a force that had industrialized victory itself, and at the heart of this seemingly unstoppable machine was something deceptively simple: logistics. Specifically, the Red Ball Express. For centuries, the iron law of logistics had governed armies. An army could advance only as far and as fast as its supply lines permitted. German doctrine, refined over years on the Eastern Front, assumed that rapid advances would inevitably create vulnerable salients, forcing a pause, allowing defenses to solidify. They had seen their own sophisticated railway and horse-drawn systems collapse under the vastness of Russia. They knew the limits. But the Americans? They were violating this law with impunity. Patton's Third Army was racing across France, hundreds of miles from the Normandy beaches. Yet somehow, it continued to receive fuel, ammunition, food, and spare parts in quantities that defied military logic. This wasn't a trickle. It was a flood. Muller's observations weren't an anomaly. They were a snapshot of a logistical marvel. Imagine each of those trucks carrying 750 gallons of gasoline. They passed his observation post every 30 seconds, 24 hours a day, without pause, without rest, without end. For the German Wehrmacht, a fraction of that, supporting even a single division, would have been a logistical triumph. This was just one artery-feeding one army. The numbers circulating through German intelligence channels were more demoralizing than any artillery barrage. The Third Army alone consumed 800,000 gallons of gasoline per day. Let that sink in. A single American army used more fuel daily than the entire German Army Group B had received in the previous month. The implications were catastrophic. If the Americans could sustain such consumption rates, if they could move such quantities without interruption, then every calculation the Wehrmacht had made about defensive lines, about trading space for time, about wearing down Allied momentum, was fundamentally, devastatingly wrong. What these German officers were witnessing was nothing less than the world's first fully motorized supply system operating at maximum capacity, a manifestation of American industrial power projected directly onto the battlefield. This wasn't just a convoy, it was an industrial process. Within 72 hours of its inception, the Red Ball Express had 132 truck companies operational, moving an incredible 12,500 tons of supplies daily. To put that in perspective, the entire German rail network in France, at its absolute peak, had never moved more than 8,000 tons per day to frontline units. The American approach wasn't just better, it was a different game entirely. General Otto Elfelt, captured near Brest, later provided chilling testimony. During his transport to prisoner camps, he counted the vehicles he passed. In a mere 20 minutes of travel, he observed more operational trucks than his entire corps had possessed at the start of the Normandy campaign. And it wasn't just the quantity. Every vehicle was in perfect mechanical condition. Every driver had a relief operator. Every truck carried extra fuel for its own consumption. The phrase he used during interrogation, speaking flawless German to an intelligence officer, became legendary. "Your supply system," he said, "it operates like a factory assembly line, only in reverse. Instead of bringing parts to build machines, you bring fuel to move machines. We cannot compete with this. We are still fighting the last war while you are fighting the next one." Elfelt was more profoundly correct than he could have known. The Red Ball Express operated on principles developed not in military academies, but in Detroit's auto factories. Colonel Loren Albert Ayres, nicknamed Little Patton, who helped organize the system, had studied American industrial methods. This system applied assembly line efficiency to military logistics with ruthless precision. Trucks were loaded in exactly 9 minutes using predetermined patterns. Drivers worked in shifts, keeping vehicles moving continuously. Maintenance stations were positioned every 50 miles, operating like Formula One pit stops, changing oil and tires without stopping the flow of traffic. The entire system was designed for one purpose: to maintain the momentum of Patton's advance, to keep his tanks rolling eastward faster than German units could establish defensive positions. Major Hans Rütiger, a staff officer with Panzer Brigade 106, saw this firsthand. On September 2nd, his unit tried to establish a blocking position near Verdun, assured by headquarters that the Americans had outrun their supplies. This was German doctrine. Rapid advances create salients that become traps when supply lines are cut. Rommel's Africa Corps had learned it in the desert. The 6th Army had died learning it at Stalingrad. But as Rütiger positioned his 8 operational Panthers overlooking the Meuse River Valley, he witnessed something that shattered these assumptions. The road below was solid with American vehicles, not combat units, but supply trucks, hundreds of them, flowing eastward without pause. Through his binoculars, he could read the nomenclature: GMC CCKW, the legendary deuce and a half, each capable of carrying 2.5 tons over any terrain. These were not the requisitioned civilian vehicles the Wehrmacht relied upon, constantly breaking down, requiring specialized parts. These were purpose-built military trucks, standardized with interchangeable parts, maintained by mechanics trained on identical vehicles. The mathematics Rütiger observed were staggering. In 1 hour, he counted 240 trucks passing his position. That represented 600 tons of supplies delivered in 60 minutes to units that were supposedly isolated and vulnerable. His 8 Panthers carried enough ammunition for perhaps 20 minutes of sustained combat. The Americans below him were moving enough supplies to sustain a division for a week. He withdrew without firing a shot, radioing headquarters that the position was untenable. In his war diary, discovered after his capture in March 1945, he wrote, "We face not an army but a conveyor belt. They do not supply their forces. They manufacture victory through logistics." Perhaps the most devastating testimony came from General Hermann Bernhard Ramke, commander of the 2nd Fallschirmjäger Division. He had fought in Crete, North Africa, and Russia before defending Brest against American forces. Before the siege, his reconnaissance units captured an American supply convoy that had taken a wrong turn. The 20 trucks they seized contained more supplies than his entire division had received in the previous 2 months. 10,000 gallons of gasoline, 500 cases of sea rations, 100,000 rounds of small arms ammunition, spare parts for vehicles his men had never seen, chocolate bars, cigarettes, instant coffee, and mail from home dated less than 2 weeks earlier. But it was the drivers who truly shocked Ramke. They were African-American soldiers from the 3916th Quartermaster Truck Company, part of the Red Ball Express. Under interrogation, they revealed details Ramke initially refused to believe. They drove 10 hours per shift, then were relieved by fresh drivers who took the same truck for another 10 hours. The vehicles never stopped moving, except for fuel and maintenance. Each driver had been trained for 3 months specifically for this operation. They had driver's manuals, maintenance schedules, standardized procedures for every contingency. When Ramke asked about horses, essential to German logistics, the captured sergeant simply laughed and said they had only seen horses pulling German equipment. This revealed another dimension of American power that German ideology could not process. Nazi doctrine proclaimed American society weak because of its racial diversity. Yet here were black soldiers, supposedly inferior according to German racial theory, operating complex machinery with a skill and efficiency that exceeded anything Ramke had seen in the Wehrmacht. They spoke of technical training schools, mechanical aptitude tests, specialized courses in convoy operations. The German military, which prided itself on racial purity and martial superiority, was being outdriven and outsupplied by Americans it had dismissed as mongrels. It was a profound and humiliating cultural clash. General Heinrich Eberbach, commanding Panzer Group West, provided perhaps the most comprehensive German assessment. Captured on August 31st, he spent days being transported, observing the full scope of the Allied supply system. In a post-war memoir, he recalled his growing amazement at the seemingly infinite resources flowing toward the front. Every bridge had been rebuilt stronger than before, Eberbach wrote. Every road had been widened and reinforced. Engineers followed the combat units so closely that sometimes they were captured in the front lines. They built supply dumps every 20 miles, each one larger than our biggest depots in Germany. They laid pipelines for fuel following the advance like veins following blood. I saw more vehicles in one day of captivity than I had commanded in my entire career. Eberbach was particularly struck by the American approach to equipment losses. When he mentioned that his Panzer Group had been reduced to 17 operational tanks, his interrogator casually mentioned that the Third Army had received 400 replacement Shermans in the previous week. When Eberbach expressed disbelief, he was shown supply manifests, tank engines airlifted from Detroit, complete artillery pieces shipped from arsenals that didn't even exist when the war began, radios manufactured at a rate of 1,000 per day. The Americans didn't repair, they replaced. They didn't conserve, they consumed. They didn't husband resources, they overwhelmed through abundance. This magnificent waste, as some called it, was actually an expression of ultimate efficiency. The cost of waiting for repairs far outweighed the cost of simply deploying a new machine. It was a factory mindset, a luxury only an industrial giant could afford. The systematic collection of German officer observations by American intelligence units revealed a pattern of psychological collapse in the face of logistical superiority. Lieutenant Colonel Robert Allen, an intelligence officer with Patton's Third Army, compiled these reactions in a report that would influence American military doctrine for decades. German officers consistently expressed variations of the same theme. They had prepared for tactical battle, but encountered industrial warfare. They had trained to fight soldiers, but faced an assembly line. They had studied Napoleon and Clausewitz, but confronted Henry Ford and Alfred Sloan. General Johannes von Luttwitz, commander of the 2nd Panzer Division, captured near Bastogne, provided a retrospective analysis that captured the German officer corps' complete misunderstanding of American capabilities. "We calculated based on our experience," he told interrogators. On the Eastern Front, the Soviets had numbers, but primitive logistics. They relied on American trucks and spam. We assumed the Americans, fighting far from home, would be even more constrained. We didn't realize they had brought America with them. Every soldier was a small factory of destruction, supplied like no army in history. Von Lutwitz described watching American infantry units in combat, noting details that revealed the depth of this logistical superiority. Every squad had a radio powered by batteries that arrived fresh weekly. Every platoon had a medic with sulfur drugs and morphine that German hospitals lacked. Every company had hot food daily, brought forward in insulated containers. American soldiers discarded equipment that German troops would have treasured. Wool socks worn once, underwear changed daily, razors used and thrown away. The logistics system didn't just supply the army, it maintained a standard of living that exceeded what German civilians experienced before the war. It was a projection of the American consumer economy onto the battlefield. The Red Ball Express represented only the most visible element of a supply system that operated with industrial efficiency. Behind it lay a network of supply bases, each one a masterpiece of organization. General Walter Warlimont, deputy chief of the Wehrmacht operations staff, later testified at Nuremberg about a captured American supply dump his unit discovered. The depot covered 40 acres and contained supplies categorized with scientific precision. Every item was cataloged, indexed, and cross-referenced. Requisitions were processed in hours, not weeks. Stock levels were maintained automatically, with reorders triggered by consumption rates calculated by IBM machines. This was not military supply as we understood it, Warlimont testified. This was scientific management applied to warfare. They had reduced logistics to mathematics, to formulae that could be calculated and executed with precision. We still relied on staff officers with experience and intuition. They relied on systems that functioned regardless of personnel. Any American sergeant could operate their supply system more efficiently than our best quartermasters. The German officers' education in American logistics continued through the fall of 1944, as Patton's Third Army maintained its relentless advance despite supply lines that now stretched over 500 miles. Wehrmacht doctrine insisted this was impossible. German staff colleges taught that 300 miles was the absolute maximum for motorized supply, and that assumed perfect weather and no enemy interference. Yet the Americans sustained operations at distances that should have caused complete logistical collapse. Oberst Graf von Schwerin, chief of staff of the 116th Panzer Division, documented his observations during the division's retreat through Belgium. His unit was reduced to siphoning fuel from abandoned vehicles, while American columns passed on parallel roads with trucks carrying nothing but gasoline. German ammunition was rationed to 10 rounds per day for artillery pieces. Americans fired preparatory barrages that lasted hours. German wounded waited days for evacuation. Americans flew casualties to hospitals in England within hours of being wounded. The inequality was not just material, von Schwerin wrote in a captured letter to his wife. It was organizational, philosophical, almost spiritual. We fought with scarcity thinking, conserving every round, every liter of fuel. They fought with abundance thinking, knowing that whatever they consumed would be replaced tomorrow. This changes everything about how one fights. We attacked to capture supplies. They attacked because they had supplies. It's a profound shift in mindset, one that dictates strategy and morale. The most telling German observation came from Hauptmann Klaus Friedrich, a supply officer with the 17th SS Panzergrenadier Division. Captured in October 1944 after his unit ran out of fuel, he provided a professional assessment that his interrogators considered so insightful it was forwarded to Eisenhower's headquarters. "You have solved the fundamental problem of modern warfare," Friedrich told his captors. "Not tactics, not strategy, but the continuous supply of mechanized forces at the limits of their advance. Your Red Ball Express is not a supply line. It is a weapon system. Every truck driver is effectively a combat multiplier, enabling 10 men at the front to fight continuously. We Germans perfect the art of war. You Americans have industrialized it. Friedrich went on to describe the cascading effects of American logistical superiority. German units spent 60% of their time foraging for supplies, requisitioning from civilians, cannibalizing damaged equipment. American units spent that time training, maintaining equipment, or resting. German officers devoted most of their planning to managing scarcity. American officers could focus on tactical execution. German soldiers fought hungry, cold, and anxious about ammunition. American soldiers fought fed, warm, and confident in their supply chain. This wasn't just about efficiency. It was about preserving human capital and maximizing combat effectiveness. The psychological impact extended beyond senior officers. Gerhard Jan Burkhardt, a truck driver with the 9th Panzer Division, described in his diary the demoralizing effect of encountering American logistics. His unit's vehicles broke down constantly, requiring improvised repairs with salvaged parts. They drove on synthetic fuel that damaged engines and reduced performance. Their trucks, a mixture of German, French, Czech, and Italian manufacturers, required different spare parts, different tools, different maintenance procedures. Then we saw the Americans, Burkhardt wrote. Every truck identical, every driver with the same manual, every mechanic with the same tools. They changed tires in 5 minutes. We spent hours patching tubes. They had special wrenches for every bolt. We made do with pliers and hammers. They received new engines by airlift. We pushed dead vehicles off the road and marched. This isn't just a physical difference. It's a mental one. Imagine the crushing feeling of being outclassed at every turn, not by individual bravery, but by an entire system. The Red Ball Express achieved its peak efficiency in early September 1944, delivering 12 tons of supplies in a single day. This seemingly dry statistic represented more combat power than most German divisions possessed in total. It meant that Patton's Third Army could maintain continuous offensive operations, never pausing to consolidate, never allowing German forces time to organize coherent defenses. The traditional operational pause that had characterized warfare since ancient times, the moment when advancing armies stopped to rest and resupply, had been eliminated through industrial logistics. General Gunther Blumentritt, Chief of Staff to Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, later wrote the most comprehensive German analysis of American logistics in his post-war memoirs. He identified 3 revolutionary aspects that German military thinking had failed to anticipate. First, the Americans had completely motorized not just combat units, but their entire supply chain, eliminating the speed differential between horse-drawn and motorized elements that had plagued the Wehrmacht. Second, they had standardized equipment to a degree that made mass production and maintenance possible on a battlefield scale. Third, and most importantly, they had created redundancy at every level, from spare trucks to duplicate supply routes to excess capacity that could absorb losses without system failure. We Germans prided ourselves on efficiency, Blumentritt wrote, on doing more with less, on the triumph of will over material. The Americans demonstrated that in modern war, material multiplied by organization equals victory. They did not do more with less. They did everything with more. More trucks than we had horses. More fuel than we had ammunition. More spare parts than we had weapons. We were artists of war. They were engineers of victory. This fundamental misunderstanding of modern mechanized warfare would contribute directly to the failure of the German Ardennes offensive, the Battle of the Bulge, in December 1944. The plan assumed American forces could be separated from their supply lines, that captured fuel depots could sustain German advances, that the Red Ball Express could be interdicted. Every assumption proved false. American logistics units simply rerouted around threatened areas, established new supply dumps within hours, and continued delivering fuel and ammunition at rates that sustained defensive operations even during the height of the German attack. The famed SS commander Jochen Peiper, whose Kampfgruppe spearheaded the assault, later testified about his growing realization that the offensive was doomed when he observed American supply resilience. His unit had been promised captured American fuel depots would sustain their advance. Instead, they found depots destroyed by thermite grenades, fuel contaminated with sugar, and supply troops who had evacuated everything useful hours before German arrival. Meanwhile, American units that should have been cut off and desperate continued to receive supplies by airlift, by rerouted convoys, by methods that demonstrated redundancy and flexibility German planning hadn't imagined. General Heinz Guderian, the architect of Blitzkrieg, and by late 1944, chief of the German General Staff, received reports from the Western Front that fundamentally challenged his theories. Guderian had revolutionized military thinking by demonstrating how concentrated armor could achieve decisive breakthroughs. But the Americans had revolutionized his revolution, showing that mechanized forces without mechanized logistics were ultimately as limited as the horse-drawn armies they replaced. In a staff conference, Guderian admitted what no German general had previously acknowledged. We developed the tactics of mechanized war, but the Americans have developed its logistics. Tactics without logistics is like a bullet without a gun. Impressive in concept, useless in practice. Every Panther tank we produce requires a supply chain we cannot maintain. Every Sherman they produce comes with the trucks to fuel it, the parts to repair it, and the infrastructure to sustain it indefinitely. And this wasn't just a military observation, it was a profound economic and industrial truth. The Red Ball Express continued operations until November 16, 1944, when the opening of the port of Antwerp and the restoration of French railways reduced the need for emergency trucking. In its 83 days of operation, it delivered over 412,000 tons of supplies, sustained the fastest military advance in modern history, and demonstrated a model of logistics that would influence military thinking for generations. But its greatest achievement may have been psychological. It showed German professional officers that their entire conception of military operations was obsolete. Oberst Hans von Luck, one of the Wehrmacht's most respected tactical leaders, captured in April 1945 after his unit ran out of fuel for the final time, provided perhaps the most eloquent summary. He told his interrogators, "We came to understand that we were not fighting the American army. We were fighting the American nation. Your tanks were not weapons but products manufactured like automobiles and delivered like mail. Your soldiers were not warriors but workers efficiently operating machinery of war. Your generals were not strategists but managers, organizing victory like a business enterprise. You did not defeat us in battle. You processed us through a production line of destruction." General Fritz Bayerlein, commander of the Panzer Lehr Division and Rommel's former chief of staff in Africa, offered a comparison that resonated through the German officer corps. "In Africa, we were defeated by the desert and the British. In Russia, we were defeated by the winter and the Soviets. In France, we were defeated by trucks and the Americans. Of the three, the trucks were the most humiliating, because they showed us that everything we believed about warfare was wrong. This wasn't just about statistics. It was about a fundamental transformation. The American logistics system operated on principles of industrial management that German military culture, rooted in Prussian tradition and Nazi ideology, could neither understand nor replicate. Initiative was pushed down to the lowest levels, with sergeant truck drivers authorized to make routing decisions that in the Wehrmacht required officer approval. Efficiency was measured not by conservation, but by throughput, not by minimizing waste, but by maximizing delivery. Problems were solved through material abundance rather than individual heroism. Major Wilhelm Ritter von Thoma, a supply officer with the 12th SS Panzer Division, documented the cultural clash. We Germans approached war as an art to be mastered through genius and will. The Americans approached it as an engineering problem to be solved through resources and organization. We sought decisive battle. They sought continuous pressure. We measured victory by ground gained. They measured it by supplies delivered. We were playing chess. They were running a factory. This profound shift from an art of war to an engineering problem holds an incredible lesson, not just for military strategists, but for all of us. Think about any complex endeavor in your own life. A project at work, building a business, even planning a vacation. The front line is your immediate task. Your strategy is how you plan to tackle it. But what about your personal logistics? Your planning, your preparation, your tools, your resources, your support system. In our modern world, we often celebrate the brilliant innovator, the charismatic leader, the person with the genius idea. But how often do we acknowledge the unsung heroes of process, of systems, of reliable supply? The software engineers building the infrastructure, the customer service teams handling the complexities, the logistics companies ensuring products arrive on time. The Red Ball Express reminds us that the best tactic or strategy can be rendered utterly useless without the underlying logistical backbone to support it. This lesson resonates deeply today. Look at global supply chains, disaster relief, even managing a successful online business. Those who can consistently deliver, who build redundant systems, who prioritize efficient flow over individual brilliance, are the ones who ultimately prevail. The ability to manage resources, not just create them, is a superpower. The German officers who witnessed Patton's fuel convoys rolling east were observing more than military logistics. They were witnessing the emergence of a new form of national power, where industrial capacity, organizational efficiency, and systematic planning trumped traditional military virtues. The Red Ball Express represented American society itself, diverse, mechanized, abundant, and relentlessly efficient, projected onto the battlefield with results that professional soldiers, trained in centuries of European military tradition, could neither comprehend nor counter. As General Alfred Jodl, chief of the Wehrmacht operations staff, signed the instrument of surrender on May 7, 1945, he reportedly told his aide, "We did not lose to a better army. We lost to a better system." That system, symbolized by the endless convoys of the Red Ball Express, represented not just American military power, but American industrial democracy. Not just logistics, but the logic of mass production applied to mass destruction. The German officers who watched those trucks rolling east were witnessing the future of warfare, a future where victory belonged not to the nation with the best soldiers, but to the nation with the most trucks. Not to military genius, but to industrial management. Not to warrior spirit, but to systematic supply. The Red Ball Express operated for only 83 days, but its impact on military thinking lasted decades. It demonstrated that in modern industrial warfare, logistics was not just important, but decisive, not just supportive, but determinative. The German officers who observed it learned this lesson with devastating clarity. Their testimony stands as both historical record and a stark warning. In the age of mechanized warfare, the nation that cannot sustain its forces cannot prevail, regardless of tactical skill or operational brilliance. The trucks rolling east on the Red Ball Highway were not just carrying supplies to Patton's Third Army. They were carrying the future of warfare, a future that left the Wehrmacht and its proud officer corps consigned to history, defeated not by superior strategy, but by superior supply, not by better generals, but by better logistics, not by military might, but by industrial abundance projected with ruthless efficiency onto the battlefield of Western Europe. It's a testament to the hidden power of systems and the profound truth that sometimes the most mundane and overlooked aspects of an operation are the ones that truly win the war.